I'm glad to see y'all come out. We got a beautiful day, a lot better than 2 weeks ago when it was torrential downpours, so this is much better. Today we're going to focus on the story of the village of Lafayette. We start here because it really all began here at this location with the mill. And we'll stay here a little bit so you can relax and have some shade. The walk eventually, we'll walk around the backside, talk about some of the other buildings. We'll talk about the people who worked here, what they made here, and the lives that they led. But I also want to point out that about 3 years ago we put up a self-guided walking tour sign on the complex that was paid for with a grant. There's 6 of them. One of them is here. A lot of the photographs are wonderful because they came out of a 1913 book that someone had written the names of all the workers on them on the backs of the pictures. So we were able to reproduce the pictures, and we have the vast majority of the folks who were working in the mill at that time frame. We know what their names were. So if you're a local, you may be able to look in the eyes of a long-lost relative you've never seen before in these pictures. So it's a pretty cool thing. But there's 6 signs all the way around that kind of give this same story. So you can come back again and do it again with friends and neighbors and family if you like. So let's begin at the very beginning. And at the beginning is all that river. You know, the Shiwatuk River, a very small stream. The Native American word Shiwatuk means hidden place by the small stream, and it is a small stream. And industry began here like every place that there was a stream with a drop, that people began to utilize it as industrial sites. Many of them were tied to farming, grist mills and such. But at this location in 1800, we ended up with the beginnings of industry here. So that's something to think about, that since 1800 there has been industry at this location, 225 years nearly at this point. And the first things that were here were this small stream powered a grist mill and a snuff mill, and interestingly enough, a tannery. Records that we see from the early 1800s show this tannery tanning traditional leathers like cowhides, but also having a whole different business line where they also tanned porpoise hides that were captured in the Narragansett Bay, and it was used for fine saddle leather. So think about the changes in the bay and the biota that was here, that in the 1800s there was enough of a porpoise population seasonally in the bay that they were able to cull some out and make that kind of product here at this very location. Now, when you're talking about the 1800s and a textile mill or any other kind of mill, you have to think about the water, which is essentially the power source for the industry that's here. And this particular stream is small, and its mill pond, which was created for those early industries, is also small. And really, what a mill pond is, you have to go back to your high school physics now. It's boring, I know, but the difference between potential and kinetic energy. Now, potential energy is stored energy, and that's what a mill pond really it's a giant battery. A mill pond is water that's held back so they can run through, over a waterfall, through a drop in the elevation of the pond, and spin a water wheel that turns that potential energy into kinetic energy, and then it's used to run some kind of a mill. And a mill is just an old English word, or place where you make things, so essentially is what it means. So anything could be done at a mill. So this operation went on here for a while in 1800, but by the first third of the 1800s, a lot of mill sites were starting as the Industrial Revolution kind of ramped up in the United States into more profitable enterprises that could use these mill streams. And the mills, the grist mill, the snuff mill, and the tannery were replaced by the beginnings of the textile industry in southern Rhode Island. And the first things here was a spinning mill where yarn would be spun for people who sheared their own sheep, and this became a very kind of a cottage industry. The person who ran it worked pretty much on a barter system. He ran the mill here. People would bring their wool in after they had carded it at home, and he would spin it for them into yarn, and they'd come back to get their yarn. Housewives could then take it home and weave it into whatever they wanted to. And he largely got paid by what was called the keep, which is a agreed upon percentage of whatever he spins became his. He could use it for his own family or try to sell it in a local general store in the community. So For a while there, for about 20 years, that was what was here, a spinning wheel or spinning mill. Eventually, though, as the 1800s worked along and we get into the 1840s, and the textile industry is step by step getting more mechanized, and more processes are allowed to be done by machines. In the beginning, carding was done by a machine, and carded wool was taken to somebody's house, and a woman would spin it into yarn, and then they added the ability to spin yarn out of wool. Then they moved into a situation where they were able to weave it in a factory, and that's where this ended up in the 1840s, with an expansion of this location, the construction of the brick building we see there, where all the exercising people who make me feel guilty all the time every time I come here. That's their job. They come here and I feel guilty, but just for a short while. I get over it. They're running around throwing giant tractor tires and all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, wow, that's something. Maybe I should do that. I don't think so. So that was originally constructed as part of that mid-1840s mill, and along here you can see the remains of a foundation that wrapped around the mill pond. See it in the wall right there? That was a large L-shaped wooden mill building that shows up in some of the photos that are on here. That was the original mill that was here, and it was a full-scale mill making woolen cloth from start to finish, and then being taken to this building, which was the dye house, and being dyed into various colors and such. So for a long time, that was the mill that was here, the two-story wooden mill that was there, and the dye house building. But then what happened, to get the dates right, in the 1840s, there's a family called the Sanfords who were involved in the textile industry here in southern Rhode Island, purchased that mill for a very specific purpose. And this little story, a little vignette, tells us a little bit about marriage amongst upper class people. I mean, we think about marriage as being all based on romantic love, and some marriages in the 1800s were, but in that kind of a class, it really wasn't. Now, the Sanfords had something in mind. They had a daughter that was of marrying age, and they knew that there was a member of the extended family of the Hazards down in South Kingstown, who was a Rodman, who was interested in getting off the ground with a textile mill. So a deal was struck, and we'll talk more about that deal later, where as part of the dowry for Robert Rodman to marry into the Sanford family, he was given this textile mill at a really good price. And the deal was, you're going to marry my daughter, and we're going to involve this. By that time, the Hazards and Rodmans in South Kingstown were doing really well, and the Sanfords wanted to get into that, and that's the best way to do it, is to marry your daughter into it. So, let's face it, your competitor's less likely to stab you in the back when you're not looking when he's related to you. And that's basically the mentality they were working upon. So when that happens, Robert Rodman buys the place. He gets married into the Sanford family. He moves up here from South Kingstown up to Lafayette, and moves in here in a small house, which we'll visit across the way, and begins to think about his ideas and his dreams, because Robert Rodman had dreams of being in the world of high-scale fabric milling. And he had just this little thing to start with, and again, he's got a very small battery here. He can't really do too much, and he's wondering, how am I going to compete with the really big mills on the really big rivers, the Merrimack River and the rivers up in northern Rhode Island, these rivers that are huge, that allow for continuous, constant water power. How does he compete? What does he do? And he had a lot of ideas in his head, and he didn't know what to do. And one day he was going with his family to what became the very first precursor to the World's Fair, which is the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, which was in Philadelphia in 1876. And it was really a showcase of American ingenuity and American ingenuity and technology at this fair. The mechanical hall, and in that hall, as he's walking around, he did have some fabrics that he exhibited and won a prize that were made here, but he's walking around with his family after the textile show is over, and he walks into this hall and he sees his future right in front of him. A giant machine made by another Rhode Island company, the Corliss Steam Engine Company. This giant Corliss steam engine was running the entire building. It was there in the middle of middle of the mill, and it was running, or the middle of the exposition hall, and it was running the entire building, all the exhibits, everything around. Rodman stood there in front of this machine, and he had basically his epiphany, his moment of epiphany, where he realized, this is how I compete. I don't need a big river. I need one of these machines. So he went right up to the table at Corliss and signed up for one that moment. Came back here to Lafayette and began to dream his big dream. Purchasing property, hiring folks to design the textile mill, and building this building. The hive that we stand behind is the first new addition, which was the place where the Corliss steam engine, this is the engine house where the Corliss steam engine was going to be assembled that would run all of this. And from here he had the large brick mill constructed and began his expansion to begin to compete in the world of the large-scale textile players. So what we're going to do now is move over. We'll go shady spots today. We're going to head to the next shady spot over by the tower of that mill and talk a little bit about this building itself, the mill building, and what goes on in that. All right, so as I said, he comes back from the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876 with a dream. He's lucky because he has hazard money behind him, because his mother is of the Hazard family, so he's got hazard money behind him. He signs up for one of those big new Corliss steam engines. And of course, Corliss didn't invent the steam engine. They've been around for quite a while. But what Corliss did is equivalent to what Henry Ford did with automobiles. He came up with a design for a steam engine that was versatile, wasn't enormous. They were big, don't get me wrong. They were big machines, but not as big as earlier steam engines that could really generate incredible amounts of horsepower. And so he signs up for that steam engine. He knows this is the way, his entry point into the big world of the textile industry. Comes back, gets himself a designer and a plan, purchases property, and starts buying raw materials. And lo and behold, by 1878, 2 years later, he's got this building and the powerhouse building constructed in 2 years flat. Think about what that all involved, because you got to think about the number of workers that were here. Imagine the hive of busy activity this was here. Talk about a hive. And all of the materials were coming in, every brick, every window, every beam on the rail line up where the Wickford Junction, up where the Walmart is now. All the material was coming in here, being hauled down to this site, back and forth, up and down, where Robert Rodman's Teamsters that were hiring here to haul this raw material here so he could construct this remarkable building. It's 3 stories, obviously, 316 feet long. The 2 towers are 50 feet tall. The engine house had the Corliss steam engine, of course, and on the other side of it was a smokestack that was 92 feet high, so that you could get the smoke. This machine burned coal, so there was a lot of black smoke billowing out of it, and the height of the smokestack was to get the black smoke into the prevailing winds that would carry it away, rather than having it settle down in his village. So in that small period of time, he's got this all going. Now, the towers themselves were functional. They were utilized for moving material from floor to floor, moving people from floor to floor. But as you can see by them, all of the mill owners at a time frame were using the towers to make a statement. I mean, there are architectural elements to the building as well, and what they're saying is, look at me, look at the grand building I'm constructing here. And of course, he went with brick because, we're still in a time frame where we don't really have electricity available, and all the lighting in mills, and you'll see them if you look at old textile mills, there's loads and loads of windows in them, because these people are going to work as long as they can work, and you want to use the minimal amount of lighting inside, which was with oil lamps, because fire is the enemy of a textile mill. The floors are soaked in lubricating oils from all the different machineries that it's in there. There's dry dust flying everywhere that's easily ignitable, and so you want to have very few ignition sources inside the building. So having all the light, and God forbid if you do have a fire, if you have a brick mill building like this, you'll minimize your loss. An entire a wooden building will go up and be gone, and you're starting from scratch. So at that time that's why most of the mills that were being constructed were switched over to either stone or brick for that purpose. The processes that went on here, this was a mill that operated from the top down. And what I mean by that is raw material would be coming into the site and then hauled up through dumbwaiters in the towers. And so bales of cotton and wool were on the top floor. And that was where the carding and spinning occurred. So you're taking the wool bale apart, you're putting it through a carder, you're carding it to get all the raw material out of it that you don't want, like some sticks and stuff, and getting it all straight so that you can then run it through the spinner, and the spinner will turn it from raw wool into yarn. Same with cotton. And from there, then the yarn goes down to the second floor where all the actual weaving looms were, and all the weaving occurred at that middle floor. And then finally, the bottom floor was where final processing would occur, inspections, loading it up, getting it prepared to be shipped out to his market. And we'll talk a little bit about that process as well. But so the whole place was a buzzing hive of activity here.
Tim, what kind of material were they making? Cotton, wool, a mixture? What was?
For the most part, Rodman had jumped into the boat at that time frame with the prevalent material that was going on in New England. That's a worsted fabric, so it's part cotton and part wool to get the benefit of both. You know, if you have an all wool piece of fabric, you know what happens. It shrinks, it gets misshapen, it's itchy. But you know, it does have that great heat retention, so it makes for a nice piece of fabric. But if you can utilize cotton and wool together, you get the benefits of both. You know, you have cotton as the warp and wool as the weft. You end up with a fabric that won't shrink so much and will hold up better and works better for sewing into other items. And so he was utilizing the mill, like many mill owners were then, to make this new worsted fabric, which required different kinds of looms because, you know, you're using two very different materials on the loom. So it was challenging to get a loom that could do that. And you know, he bought looms specifically designed to make worsted fabric. He was probably buying a lot of wool locally. There was, as you know, you can imagine, there were a lot of farmers at that time that were switching over to wool production because there was such a market now in southern Rhode Island and in New England in general now, as the textile industry really ramped up here in New England for wool. So he was probably buying a lot of his wool locally, but the cotton was coming in from the south. At the same time that Rodman purchased this property and began the construction, he used more of his funding to purchase half of the dock down at the end of Main Street, which we now call the town wharf. We always like to think of it as a public space, but it really wasn't a public space in the 17 and 18 and even into the early 1900s. It was privately owned. At that time, half of it was owned by the Baker family, which is kind of interesting, for coal operation that they ran out of there, and the other half was owned by Robert Rodman. So he's having cotton bales coming in Wickford, and he's also having coal come into Wickford because this machine here in there, the coreless steam engine, it's a monster. It needs coal constantly, needs to be fed with coal. And so Rodman has all these teamsters that he hired to bring the brick and all the stuff to make the building. He keeps them on, and he has teamsters going 24/7 pretty much back and forth from Wickford, hauling coal and raw materials up into this facility for work. So as you can imagine, this was a busy place, and he had lots of workers going on in the construction phase, and then as he moved into operation, began to expand, he in the end had hundreds of workers working here in Lafayette, a place that he essentially purchased all the land around the mill. Essentially, he owned the entire village of Lafayette by the time all was said and done. Every building you see, every church, everything, it was owned by Robert Rodman. This was a true southern Rhode Island mill village, and he owned the whole shooting match. Any questions now about the mill building?
How many churches were there, Tim?
Two churches here, yeah. First the small one, which is now down on the edge of Lafayette Road, and then later on the big church we'll visit later.
And what was the workforce like?
He was lucky. He got off the ground floor quickly, so his workforce was almost all Rhode Islanders. Some of the other mills who took time to get going, particularly Hamilton Webb and Belleville mills, they ramped up later, and the workforce in the area was pretty much depleted. And those mills really account for the realities of why this part of Rhode Island has a population that is kind of heavy in Irish and French Canadians, because The French Canadians were sending their children when as the agrarian economy of Canada collapsed, sending their children, other than their eldest son, down into New England to get jobs. And of course, we all know what happened in Ireland with the potato famine. And so lots of immigrants were coming into the location to work in those other two big mills. But this mill was largely staffed with Rhode Islanders, many of them right from here. But we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So right now we're going to move across the way to the stable building over there, which is now, was a daycare up until recently. I don't know if it still is, but dance studio. So back in the day, this was called the barn, this building, and it really was all about those Teamsters I talked about. And the Teamsters were a critical part of the operation, particularly in the first few decades of it. And when we move on, we'll see what changed that. But as I said, the Teamsters that he hired were, and a Teamster, we have a whole different meaning for that word. Now it's a truck driver who's in a union and is generally angry. But back then, a Teamster was a skilled position, a guy who had a team of draft animals that were like family to him, and he could use those draft animals to haul stuff around. That's why they were called Teamsters, a team of draft animals and a wagon. And Robert Rodman hired every Teamster he could find in the area, and stole them away from other operations to work here, because as I said, at first he had all this raw material. You can really see the building scale from back here. All of this had to come in here, including all the other buildings, and then be constructed. And after that, then he's got this constant need to haul coal and cotton up from downtown Wickford. And the Teamsters were working doing that pretty much straight out 6 days a week, and that's what people worked here, 6 days a week. And in the summertime, when it's good weather, they were working 6 14-hour days. No overtime. Now, it's none of that employee protection stuff back then. And so these guys, for 6 days a week, were hauling coal primarily back and forth to feed the coreless steam engine. They'd go down there, fill up their wagon with coal. The coal's piled up on the dock down there, and imagine the town wharf just covered in coal, because it was. 2 big coal operations down there. He's hauling coal up here. The Baker family's hauling coal to smaller businesses, and also feeding the change in how people heat their homes, as people were putting coal furnaces in their houses, and the Bakers jumped right into that whole business. So they're hauling coal out of there. Rodman's hauling coal up here. And so there's coal moving out of Wickford on a constant basis, pretty much, those 6 days a week, coming in here. And at the end of the day, the Teamster he could bed his animals down in here and take care of them. Rodman provided them with this very substantial barn, stalls all on the bottom, and hay storage up top for the teams. And so the guy could bed his teams down here, get them all set, go home to his family, and come back in the next day and start it all over again. So also part of what went on in this building was also something that's interesting to local history, is that the best, earliest fire departments that were ever most organized in New England were all associated with a mill. Because as I said, fire is the mill's enemy, and we had fire training drills. We had people who were learning professional firefighting skills, ready. They were ready to jump into action to fight a fire in this place, because a fire is going to shut this place down even though it's a brick building, it's going to shut it down for a long time. Its machinery will probably be damaged. So fighting fire was a constant thing in the back of the mind of mill owners back then. And I say that it's important to local history is because as communities got to a point where they had professional firefighters hired to protect the larger community, almost all of the leadership of every fire department in southern Rhode Island came out of somebody who had learned his skills at a textile mill. And indeed, the very first fire chief for the town of North Kingstown ended up being somebody who learned his business right here in Lafayette. And that story repeats itself over and over again as you go through these southern New England, northern New England towns. As they begin to start out fire departments, their leadership all came out of textile mills, because fighting fire was that important to mill owners that they made sure they had trained people who knew what to do, what kind of equipment they needed, and how to respond to a fire. So it's kind of interesting to think that the North Kingstown Fire Department's origins really were in this building, if you want to think about it from that perspective, because that first fire chief and all of his lieutenants in the beginning were people who learned their skills right here at the Rodman Mill. Okay, we're going to walk over and get in the shade over at the warehouse. Okay, these two buildings kind of worked in concert with each other. The warehouse was built shortly after the main textile mill, and it was utilized to haul raw material that was coming into the mill, particularly cotton and wool, before it was needed. It was right on the 10-rod road, so it made a lot of sense. Stuff coming up from Wickford, the cotton could be brought in there, stored in the building. Farmers who were bringing their wool down would go to that building and negotiate a price for the bales of wool, sell that there, and finished goods were stored on the bottom floor of this to a large degree. After they came out of the dye house, they were rolled over here and put in that building waiting to be shipped out. At that time, when that building was constructed, Robert Rodman only had the products going out on the roads by wagons and such, or else he had to haul it up to Wickford Junction and get it on rail cars up there. But concurrently with what Rodman was doing here, and we talked about this if you were on the walk last week, we talked about this. A group of Newport investors were constructing the rail line that ran from Wickford Junction down into Wickford Village so people could get to Newport, the Newport-Wickford rail and steamship line. Rodman knew about this and realized what it was going to be, what a great thing it would be if he could get a contract with them so he could bring his raw material and his coal right into the location. Now, he had to negotiate with the general partners of the Newport-Wickford rail and steamship line, principal of which was Cornelius Vanderbilt, pretty savvy guy, and he realized he had Rodman over a barrel. The negotiations went on for a couple of years before he could really get a deal set, and I don't know what the details of that deal were, but a deal set so that he could utilize the rail line off peak hours to bring in coal, haul the coal right into the yard, and also bring his raw materials in here from all sorts of locations around the United States. He can now get better pricing for cotton because he could have it shipped in on the main rail line, which by then was running pretty much from Washington D.C. up to Boston, and his finished goods could be shipped out by rail. So this was a big deal for Robert Rodman. After he got the deal signed, the track was laid in off the spur that came through here and ended up pretty much right where you see that patch right there of asphalt. Ended there at that location. There were coal storage bins off to the side. On either side, the coal would be in rail cars and be offloaded into the storage bins. And this building was constructed here as an additional building. If you look to the side of the building, you can still see the outline of the loading docks that were here right up against the rail line. And this then became the stock house or the warehouse that was utilized for raw materials coming in via rail and finished goods going out via rail. So he moved all of his operations from here, although he was still buying wool from local people and utilizing that building for that. But everything else that went on and that had anything to do with rail would come in and out of this particular building. So he's got these two buildings, the warehouse and the stock house here, operating together after he's got this deal done, and he has a much more efficient operation. He lets go a number of the Teamsters. The ones he keeps are the ones who ended up being part of the permanent fire department here, and is able to move goods in and out of his location. Eventually he sells off his half share in the dock down at the end in Wickford, and his coal is shipped in here directly via rail. So Robert Rodman now is operating very efficiently, and we're getting into a period now where he's doing really well.
What time frame now? From 1840 to 18?
Yeah, he's got this thing rolling by 1880. He's really rolling well here. He had an awful lot of extra money available to him during the Civil War period because, and we're going to talk about products now, but he got a very lucrative contract for making winter union uniform material. So he was making that kind of material they used for winter uniforms for Union troops, and then he got a contract to make the summer weight clothes for the Union troops. It's a very lucrative contract, and Rodman had a lot of funds at that time frame. So moving out of the Civil War period, he's flush with cash, and he's doing all sorts of different things here, including the purchase of the rail line and getting this building constructed so he can really operate this business efficiently. At the same time, he's taking this union money and he's buying up other textile mills. So now Robert Rodman starts out owning this place. This is the core of his business, but he also buys the Shady Lee Mill, where the Shady Lee Arts Gallery are now. He bought the Silver Spring Mill, which was across the street on Silver Spring Pond. That mill has been demolished. He purchased from his Hazard Relations the Rocky Brook Mill down in Wakefield, and he purchased another small mill. We'll use our Rhode Islandese here, where Ray's is now. So, so now he's got an empire here. This is exactly what he wanted. He used that money well. And we'll talk about how his housing changed as for himself with utilizing that money. But he's got an empire. 5 textile mills. He's utilizing Shady Lee and Silver Spring together. He sends one of his sons over there to run that operation. He's got Rocky Brook. He's got another son running Rocky Brook. He's got a couple of his kids working here with him at this textile mill. And he's a textile baron. He becomes essentially at that point the richest man in North Kingstown, #1 taxpayer in the community, the most admired man, and that's exactly what Robert Rodman expected when he married into the Sanford family. That was his dream from the beginning, and he was able to realize it. This guy was phenomenal. He's got all these workers. By now, as I said, he owns the whole community. We'll talk more about that. He's got not just mill workers, but he has people working, running the general store. He's got grounds people taking care of his mansion house and his children's mansion houses. He has carpenters, he has shopkeepers. In the end, he's got like 400 employees here and another probably 500 employees at the other textile mills. So this guy is a serious player in South County at that point. And I kind of think he probably had a little conversation or a little competition with his Hazard cousins, as the Hazard Empire too is expanding exponentially in the same time frame. And the Hazards really took it to a whole new levels of investing in all sorts of things all across the United States. But Robert Rodman was pretty satisfied with the empire that he had created here. So this is a good time for us to talk about this guy and this business empire he had. How did he, he got his initial money to get the ball rolling from loans guaranteed by his Hazard relationships. But after that, he didn't borrow money. He made money here. He and the Hazards got back together and talked about competing with those big textile mills I talked about. I mean, if you drive up through New Hampshire and you see these giant mills that go on there acres and acres, and if you look in other areas in Massachusetts, Lowell, Massachusetts, for instance, even in the Connecticut River Valley, you've got these giant mills. Robert Rodman and his Hazard cousins are saying, how can we, no matter how good we are, how can we compete with that? That broadcloth industry, we're not big enough to get in there in a big way. So what do? They were entrepreneurs, and they decided what they would do is find a niche market that they could control, that they could have complete control of, that was just the right size market for them, and that they would be able to make lots of money in this market. And they came up with a genius idea. And the market that they got into, where eventually 50 to 70% of their business was a market called the Negro Goods trade. Negro Goods trade. It's a nice, clean name, but if you came up here and walked up to that building and somebody was out there maybe having a cigarette break and said, what do you do here? He'd tell you, and part of my language here, but this is what he'd say. He'd say, here in Lafayette, we work for Robert Rodman and we make the best damn nigger cloth of anybody in the world. The best damn nigger cloth. That's what they were making here, along with the Hazards. They were making the best damn nigger cloth. And what they were doing with this fabric was selling it. One of the Hazards was moved to the South and traveled through the South. They worked as a consortium. They got more mills in South County along with them, making connections with plantation owners who, down in the South, who had hundreds of slaves, and it needed durable, inexpensive fabrics to clothe their slaves. And that was their niche. They stole that niche from England, who had it before, and all this Negro cloth would have to be shipped from England, and a few small mills in the South that were doing it. But southern New England came up and saw the niche, saw the opportunity, saw the profits available for it, because what was great about that from their perspective is you don't have to buy really high quality wool or cotton to make that stuff. It's for slaves. I mean, what the heck? You don't have to get the stuff that's really clean. You can actually buy rejected wool and cotton from other mills and use the rejected wool and cotton that wasn't good enough for your fine broadcloths that you were making in your mills, because as I said, anywhere from 50 to 40% of everything Rodman was making was still broadcloth. Fine wool suiting is what he called it, different grades of suiting for men's and women's clothing at all of his mills. Some of the wool and cotton wasn't good enough for that. And a lot of times they'd have to get rid of it, throw it away or something. But now the Rodmans and the Hazards can go around to all the mill owners and say, don't worry about discarding that wool and cotton, we'll buy it from you. And they'd buy it at rock bottom prices, haul it in here and utilize it, card it out, spin it into a fabric, and make it into the Negro cloth. They even got to a point where they were taking the burlap twine that held together the bales that they were utilizing and carding that into the fabric as well. No waste. This is a great deal when you think about it strictly from a business perspective, not from a consciousness perspective. No waste, and you turn out these fabrics that you can then sell to the slave trade. So they had all sorts of fabrics that they sold here. There are 6 or 8 lines of fabrics, but the bread and butter fabric for these textile mills in South County was a fabric that they created here, and they had a marketing program for it. They called it Kentucky Jean. And they had advertising in newspapers in the South of a big, robust woman wearing a pair of coveralls made of their fabric called Kentucky Jean and selling it. And the mill owners were selling this stuff as fast as they could make it. All the plantation owners in the Deep South were saying, we love this fabric. It's cheap, it wears like iron. We can just give a slave family a couple bolts of this, they make their clothes, and we don't have to supply them more clothes for work pants for the rest of the season. We love this fabric. It's selling like hotcakes. They also made other fabrics that could be used for shirts and dresses. Some of them just plain old cloth, very coarse cottons, but they did have one fabric that they sold, and they had it printed and colored in the dye house, and they called it a paisley fabric and sold that. But that was the bread and butter of what was going on here. All these guys making the best damn nigger cloth anybody could ever want in this industry. Now the Kentucky Jean story goes along, and as we get past the Civil War, you think the market would go away, but no. If you think about the way the South was structured after the Civil War, there's still cotton growing in the fields. We still have people owning that land, and these plantation owners have to develop for themselves a new structure of how to get that cotton to market without calling it slavery. So they end up, setting it up with this sharecropper type of idea out there. So many of the same people who were slaves on the plantations and were afraid to move north and start a new life because all they knew was raising cotton or tobacco became sharecroppers working for their former masters. And the master was then selling them the same fabric. So this fabric market continued on after the Civil War. As the 1870s brought to a close and the gold rush is occurring in California, an entrepreneurial-minded New Englander wanted to go out there and make his mark. He wasn't looking for gold. He wanted to open up a mining supply store, and he was looking for a fabric that he could utilize to make mine pants. Maybe you're getting where this story is going. Anybody got an idea what that entrepreneurial guy's name was? Levi Strauss. Levi Strauss saw this fabric being made in southern Rhode Island, this fantastic nigger cloth, and said, this stuff does wear like iron. It's perfect. I'm going to buy the fabric from them and make miner pants out there in San Francisco and sell it to miners. And so now, time we wear a pair of these, we have a history of jeans, taking the same marketing ploy that they utilized back before pre-Civil War time. We're wearing a piece of history when we wear a pair of these pants. They connect right back to slave clothing. This is the only moment right here at this point that I actually get most of the high school students, if they go on this walk, to take their eyes out of the phone and go, did that man say jeans? Did he say jeans? Yeah, he said jeans. And the teacher will then say, can you tell that again now that you have their attention? And they're flabbergasted by it once I finally got their attention, and they're just not walking around here just saying, oh, the teacher says we have to listen to this talking head. But that is the roots of Levi's and all the other jeans that we have today, and they all come from the Negro Goods cloth that was made primarily in southern Rhode Island. And southern Rhode Island cornered the market on the Negro Goods trade. And Robert Rodman and his Hazard cousins were the movers and shakers of that industry. So it's interesting as you go on, the Hazards and the Rodmans, and you think about them, and this is a story that's just now coming out in the last decade perhaps. And, you know, it's a huge story, but it was shut down by the same people that were profited from it most, because if you think about it, particularly in South Kingstown with the Hazards and North Kingstown with the Rodmans, all the kind of places that would tell this story, public libraries, schools, etc., were all financed and supported by those people. I remember talking about 15 years ago to a young librarian who wasn't from Peacedale, was working at the Peacedale Library. She called me up, she wanted to do her master's thesis or whatever on the Negro Goods trade. She had this presentation, she wanted me to see it. She says, well, I'm going to try to have a presentation in the Peacedale Library. This is probably actually more like 20 years ago now. I said, well, good luck with that. So she went to the library director. The director saw it, thought it was wonderful. They went to the board of trustees with a whole bunch of hazards sitting on it and hazard relations, and they said, see my checkbook? See it? You tell that story. My checkbook's going in my pocket for good. Same here in North Kingstown at certain times. There were Rodmans who were benefactors to the North Kingstown Library when it started, and they would walk in and say, if you get my drift, we really don't need to go back in time and tell those stories. And so, you know, you want the money from these people, so you keep it quiet. But now it's coming out, and it's all a part of an awakening. So we have an understanding, globally, of course, but also here in South County about our part in all this. And I think it's really an important thing that we tell this story, and we know what these folks were doing here and what it was all about.
Was there any evidence of them actively opposing anti-slavery activities in Rhode Island?
Oh, particularly the Hazards. Some of the Hazards would be vocal about slavery, and at the same time profiting from making slave cloth. Certain Hazards wanted to make a big story about how a freed slave in New York, and one of our Hazards sent him to college. But at the same time, they sending him to college was money that was made from slave cloth. The ironies of that, I'm sure this man who got to go to college on the Hazards probably wouldn't have cared, but the ironies of that are amazing when you think about it. But yeah, there were, especially with the Hazard family, because as I said, they were nationwide by then. The Hazards had invested in mining out in the far west, and the Hazards were they were 10 steps above Rodman as far as their business interests and the funds and the monies that they had. So it was quite a deal. But we're going to go up to that nice oak tree there and all that shade and talk a little bit about the village itself that Robert Rodman created for his people. Okay, so now we have a sense of what they were doing here. We have a little bit of a sense of how many people were working here, you know, and I'll say interesting story also about Robert Rodman. He was very adamant he was against child labor, and he would speak out against it all the time. But when you nailed him down on it, he would say that, no, he doesn't employ child here. He has a cutoff age of 13. He's not hiring anybody younger than 13. So think about that reality. And of course, there are other textile mills. There's pictures of the Hamilton Webb Company where they were just desperate for workers you could tell these are children, 9-year-old, 8-year-olds, you know, who were mill girls and mill boys working in that place. But you've got 13-year-olds. Anybody who's had a 13-year-old, I just can't imagine saying, have a good day at work, honey. You know, but that was the reality back then. You know, and Rodman, as I said, his workforce was largely Rhode Island based, but he didn't have, as he expanded here and had more things going on, he needed more workers. And again, the same thing that was happening in the French Canadian provinces was happening here in New England as well, in Rhode Island and such, as an economy that was completely based on agrarian related things other than places like Wickford, you know, farming. was now, because of changes in transportation mostly. The Erie Canal, for instance, changed the world for local farmers. You wouldn't think about it, but it's true. And all the land, the cheap land after the Civil War that was given out as bonus pay for officers who were in the Civil War, they got great chunks of land as all as a part of the government's manifest destiny idea. In other words, we need to control the entire nation from coast to coast, and they were giving away tons of land out in the area of New York State, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, huge plots of land that they were able to farm on larger scales. And then you've got this Erie Canal, which connects to rail lines, and they're able to move vast quantities of farm products into the major cities, which are still up and down the eastern seaboard, and outprice the small farmers all in New England. They weren't able to compete. So small farms are having trouble. There's not enough work to keep the farm going with all your kids. So what farmers were doing in Rhode Island as well as in French Canada was the oldest son was staying on the farm, the young children were, but all the middle kids who could work, trying to desperately to keep their families' finances afloat, they were being sent to textile mills to work. So Rodman began to take advantage of that, but he needed housing for them, and that's when he began to think about housing stock. When he first started, he was local guys, they'd go home, but now he needs housing. So he starts out, one of his purchases to expand was, and we talked about this last week, was the Carr property. Remember we talked about the Carr graveyard, folks who were out there? And this was the Carr homestead house for the Carr farm. So he purchased that, added the 2 L's, reconfigured the inside, and turned it into a 6-family house. So he could have 6 families living in that house, with the older adults all working in the textile mill and the older children working in the textile mill. This little building across the way here that we see, this little tannish building with the white window frames, that was originally on the mill parcel where the mill was constructed. And he's a swamp Yankee through and through. He's not going to waste a good house. And he's got all sorts of workers, so he had it picked up and moved and put down there, and had the interior reconfigured using carpenters that worked for him to become housing for unmarried women who didn't live close enough to go home every night. And then next to it, he builds this giant boarding house, which is housing for unmarried men. And these boarding houses, the small one for women and this one for unmarried men, were chock-a-block full all the time. And in actuality, they were at peak times. The men in particular were sleeping in shifts in the building so that there'd be somebody to work in the mill doing things that could be done early in the morning or late in the evening. So he's got housing here. Part of the property of the Carrs went all the way down towards Wickford, and he took all that land and he hired a local builder, the Sherman Brothers, to construct 2 styles of mill houses. And if you look at the houses along 10 Rudd Road in this section and down on all the side streets, if you can use your imagination, they've all been modified over time, but you can see that there's a small end gable home and a larger 2-story kind of a home that was constructed there, just dozens of each kind of them. Some of the streets, I think, might be Gardner Avenue. Gardner Avenue's houses are still very remarkably like they would have been in the time frame that they were mill houses. And Rodman owned all the property, he owned all the houses, and people would come work here. You'd start out maybe as a single man working in here. Maybe you lived in Coventry or West Greenwich. You got your feet wet here. You met a single girl next door. You got married and started to have a family. And if you were a good worker, he wanted to keep you. He wanted to retain you, because competition really became fierce for good mill workers as the textile industry just blew up. And it was all about keeping good workers. He'd offer you a house, and you live in the house, and the very reasonable cost would come out of your account at the company store, which we'll talk about. And that way he's keeping workers here. They're not saying, well, I'm married now. I'm not going to live in that boarding house anymore. I've got a family. So he was doing all these things to retain good workers, especially foreman level workers and upper level workers that, folks who were doing really skilled things like loom fixers and loom tenders, people who had a real skill that he needed, and he was offering them good housing and all the other things that this mill village had to offer. And it was really all about keeping good employees. Now this building on the other side of the car, you can just see it here, was a school that was down on Dillon Avenue for quite a time in a much smaller version. That was the school that was down there. It was called the East Lafayette Schoolhouse. Rodman hauled it up here next to the mill, paid to have a major expansion put on it so the kids could go to school here. On the other side of the property was the Lafayette Schoolhouse, and that one too also was expanded and relocated by Rodman. We'll talk about that as well. So you had at this point so many workers with so many kids that you needed 2 separate district schoolhouses to teach all these kids, you know, and you know, the Rodmans themselves were involved in the district schoolhouse system, working on the district schoolhouse board, making sure their schools were first rate, again, to retain employees. And those schoolhouses were churning out future textile mill workers. That's the way Robert Rodman looked at it. And because you got to figure this textile mill operated here by generations of Rodmans from 1847 when he started it for 110 years. So we're talking multiple generations of people who were able to say, I work for Robert Rodman, my dad worked for Robert Rodman, my grandfather worked for Robert Rodman, and I sure hope that my kids will get a job here at Rodman Manufacturing as well. It was that long standing a business and thought of as a really good place to work. And all of it was about Rodman and the Hazards too. I mean, the village of Peacedale is the same situation, realizing how important it is to retain skilled workers and also keep them happy because textile mills, especially as you got into the beginnings of the 20th century, are starting to unionize, and no unionization occurred at this textile mill or any other North Kingstown textile mill throughout that whole period of time. The mindset that they utilize is very different from the mindset of the big textile mills up in the northern parts of New England, which are all modeled on an idea that James Lowell came up with of Lowell, Massachusetts. You know, one of the really big wheels in broadcloth in Massachusetts. And it's called the Lowell model by people who study it now, and it's in direct contrast to the Rodman Hazard model that existed down here in southern Rhode Island. In the Lowell model, Lowell and his upper level people and his families, they were wealthy beyond belief, but they didn't want their workers seeing that. Their homes were somewhere else, where the average worker could not see it, to see the life that he led and end up making them feel like they're being used. In the Lowell model, they are already having to import workers mostly from overseas on a regular basis. And he took advantage of that, and he housed people together in big dormitory style housing. Most of the people he hired were single. He didn't really want married workers. He wanted them to feel like they were disenfranchised, disconnected, because they wouldn't get together and unionize. So he'd house people who didn't even speak all English together so that they wouldn't even be able to talk to each other and even begin to even think about unionization. And he used his people up. They were cogs in the machine as far as James Lowell and the people that worked in that operation were. There was no protections of the government for these people. You got hurt, you couldn't work, you're fired. You're no good to me, you're fired. If you got hurt and Rodman could see the potential, oh, he'll be back to work in a month, you're staying on the payroll. That's part of the difference in the way they ran. The Rodmans and the Hazards, their houses were right in the center of the mill village they owned. And they looked at it as if they were the grandfather of this huge family that they had created here. And they treated their people like families. They made sure they had every little thing their hearts could ever desire from, and we'll talk about all those things as we move along. And you're part of the big family. Look at me, you know, you could be me someday, you know, work hard for me, you'll move up. Yeah, so-and-so moved up, he's a foreman now. You know, they utilize that mindset to keep their workers here and to treat them with more respect than what you were finding in the James Lowell model of ways of running mill. And this way he didn't ever get unionized, and he never really had any issues with his with retaining his workers to the extent that they did in these bigger factories up in the northern parts of New England. So any questions on all that yet? This is the exciting part of the trip, is to cross the street. It's really thrilling. It's a lot better than listening to me talk. But I like to point out that please don't get hit by a car, because you will ruin the tour for everybody else. You'll have to get the police involved and all that. So
When did people start owning the houses along here?
they sold them off in the 1950s when he closed down the mill. So he still owned all the property until like 1954, 57, when the family started downsizing. And the reason they closed down had to do mostly with electricity costs. Electricity was a lot cheaper in the Carolinas than it was here, and so it was at a cost they couldn't control, and the textile industry all across New England closed down, largely for the cost of electricity to run these things. All right, let's get across the street, and we'll talk a little bit more about what went on there. Okay, we talked a little bit about in the beginning about the dowry prize that Rodman got for marrying into this family, and also there were other things that were helping out the Sanford, and Sanford are also married into the Taylor family that were part of the deal. And one of them was that Robert Rodman's wife's brother-in-law, Ambrose Taylor, was to get a job too. And these are the kind of deals that went on with this thing. We'll talk more. So what he was made the paymaster, the storekeeper, and the postmaster, all in one rolled up job, and given this building here, which was the company store at that time frame, which is actually the second company store, to live in and to run this operation in. So he would get the pay logs from the office across the way. We see the president's office right there, the little brick building. Robert Rodman and his son Franklin, who was an accountant, worked in there. So the pay logs would be sent over here to Ambrose, and he would be keeping track of things. They were keeping track of your allowance for your housing, and you had a company store account. You know, this is the whole crux of Tennessee Ernie Ford's great song. You know, there are people here old enough to remember that song. I owe my soul to the company store. You know, and that's a great way to retain employees too. You know, if somebody's a little bit overspends his account, well, you know, you can't quit. I'm sorry, you still owe us money at the company store. You got to work that off before you can leave, or unless you can pay me right now, which people couldn't. But this became quite a social center, as it was also the mail. This is the Lafayette post office at that time. And again, if you wanted to get goods for your house, you know, you could get everything you wanted here, everything you needed. You'd even need cash, because it would all be taken off your account on the pay book. You came in here and got flour and bread and some meat and some eggs, it was all taken off your account. You didn't need cash. And basically people who worked in mill villages like this, it was a cashless society. You know, you didn't really need cash. If you wanted cash, let's say you want to take the kids down to Wickford to get ice cream, say this is the late 1800s, you go in there and say to Ambrose, or who was working for him, you know, I'd like $5 of cash so I can go down and we can have a picnic down in Wickford, have some ice cream. And he'd give you $5, it would come off your account. And so everything you needed, you could get at the store. If you wanted something special that wasn't in the store, you'd go to the shopkeeper and say, I want to buy my wife a silver-plated mirror and brush set for her birthday, and you don't have it. He said, I'll get it. Come back here the day after tomorrow, I'll have it. And again, everything you needed you could get here at the store. You picked your mail up here, you got cash out of here, and you got all the things you needed to run your household here. So people would come and go from this place. The porch would usually have been located, you'd be found old timers who were retired and were living with their son who worked here now, rocking in rocking chairs and gossiping. So you can just kind of imagine the atmosphere that was going on in the building here. Sadly, it's in kind of rough shape now, but if you look at it, you can just see you can imagine what it would have been like at the time frame. Now, the original company store now still serves the community by giving us fine pizza every week. The very first company store was what is now Filippo's Pizza, back in the time frame before the wooden mill was constructed. But a company store is a critical part of a southern Rhode Island mill village. It's just one of those things that if you really want to retain your employees, you just have to have it. We're going to walk down to the other building on the side of the store, that yellow house there, and talk about another thing that's required to keep keep people in the mill.
That was the business office.
That was it. That was the nerve center for all 5 mills. Robert Rodman was in one office and Franklin in the other, and all the financial dealings, the planning for all those people all happened out of there. Okay, another thing you really need if you want to have a good mill village is to be able to satisfy the religious needs of your community. And as you get into the second half of the 1800s, it's getting harder and harder to retain a good preacher for your church. Prior to that, preachers were having to find their own housing, or they were spending 1 month with one parishioner's family, 1 month with another, blah, 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 like that. And eventually, if you wanted a good preacher, you had to provide him with housing, so he'd have a place to live. And Rodman wanted to have a good preacher. We'll see the church he constructed as a part of the deal to get him here. And he also wanted to have good housing, so this house was built as a parsonage. So he'd have this to offer to really good preachers. Say, here we go. This is a great house. You can live in this house with your family, across from the mill. Church is behind you. You couldn't ask for more. And indeed, that's why this building was constructed as a parsonage. Again, to try to retain a good preacher so they could have a good church so he could keep his workers happy. This is the beginnings of what's kind of known locally, especially in the 18 and 1900s, as Rodman Row, this house right here. It was a little less fancy in its day, but it was constructed again specifically when the mill was built, actually probably a little bit before, because it was again part of this dowry arrangement with the Sanford Taylor family. Robert Rodman's mother-in-law was a tailor, and Robert Rodman's father-in-law was stuck with his wife's 2 spinster aunts, Aunt Ann and Aunt Fanny. And it sounds like he wanted to get rid of them. So part of the deal was you give Ambrose a job, and you take Aunt Ann and Aunt Fanny with you. Then you can marry my daughter, then I'll sell you this mill at a cut rate bargain. Now Aunt Ann and Aunt Fanny were very religious women. Kind of remind me of the Baldwin women on the Waltons, but I don't think they were making the recipe or anything like that. But they came here, they were spinsters their whole lives. They lived together in this house. They sat on the porch and watched the world go by, went to church whenever they wanted to. The grass was mowed by a Rodman employee. The house was painted by a Rodman employee. Everything was done by a Rodman employee. They lived the rest of their days in this beautiful little home as part of the deal, so Robert Rodman could make that first step into the life he planned for himself. So it's kind of cool. It's a great little house, and it's just a fun story. I mean, I just can't help it. I could just imagine the father thinks, Rodman thinks he's got me over a barrel. Yeah, okay. Guess what? You're taking Aunt Ann and Aunt Fanny with you. So, and there's pictures of Aunt Ann and Aunt Fanny standing in front of the house, as I said in an earlier incarnation, but they were part of the deal. If he wanted this to go off on this adventure into entrepreneurship and enter the realm of the major textile owners, Aunt Ann and Aunt Fanny were part of the package. So we're going to walk down Advent Street and go to the church that he had constructed. Okay, the religious needs, we talked about that a little bit at the parsonage, but this is a much quieter location to go into it. The major church at the time frame that was being utilized by the workers was the Advent Christian Church, which was housed at that time in what's now known as the Hornbeam Chapel, which is now presently at the intersection of 10 Rod and Lafayette Road. Very old church, in the Advent Christian denomination. Is an interesting one, very traditional, which always, again, the ironies of the fact that now that that it's yoga and transcendental meditation going on in this I can imagine what the old timers would think about their church being used, but I would tell them, hey, guess what? They're taking great care of the building. They're respectful, and without somebody moving in there, this little building that really was difficult to sell, it would be gone now. So heck with the Maharishi, whoever, the building is there, and it's here as a part of this community, and it's still, our story still can be told. But after the big mill expansion, that little church, with all the workers he was bringing in, you know, he's got a small scale textile mill. That church was fine. It wasn't enough. And he knew it. And he wanted to get some community involvement in building this. I'm almost certain by looking at the building that although he didn't hire the architect who did St. Paul's in Wickford, he wanted something that would at least thumb their nose at the folks in Wickford that says, our church is just as nice as yours. Forget about it. And he had this church constructed in the beginning of the 1880s to house the religious needs of the community that he is growing here at a rapid pace. As I said, he had a fundraiser with people in the community. They put together what they could. I mean, these are not people who had a lot of money. They did he wanted them to have a sense of ownership of the building, so he did reach out to everybody, and they had some fundraising events, etc. But largely all the rest of the money was made up with Rodman money to build this church. It's got a 41-foot high ceiling. Inside, 74-foot high spire for the steeple. At its peak, it could seat 330 worshipers. 1942, it needed some updating. You know, 60 years later, and one of Rodman's descendants paid for that as well and redid the entire inside, got new pews, redid the interior of the church, and so it satisfied the needs of the folks who were a part of that community. But that really wasn't enough. You know, Rodman had a big community here now, and he wanted to satisfy the needs of everybody involved. He reached out to the Episcopals down in Wickford, offered them some land to build a mission church there. On the end of Indian Street there is a church now that we all think of, associate with American Indians, but that was St. Gabriel's mission from St. Paul's, so people who were Episcopals didn't have to walk down to Wickford. They could just go to church there. And you know, he did everything he could to try to supply the needs, to satisfy the religious needs for these folks. And you know, really, when you think about it in that time frame, in an age before, you know, everybody goes home and turns on a TV or looks at a phone or some other screen, people had a real social life, and the church was not only folks' religious center, but it was also their social center, so supplying a good place for that religious needs and the social needs of the community was tantamount to keeping his employees. Now, the only building that we don't have existing today from the traditional mill village is a hall, and in the lot next door to the church there was a hall called Rodman Hall, which was again used to satisfy the social needs of the community here. And as I said, he had hundreds of people working in the mill and their families. I mean, there were literally probably 1,000 people living in this little Lafayette village, all in some way or another associated with what was going on in the mill. And so they had Rodman Hall there. You know, in the beginnings of silent movies, there were guys who actually would drive around with movie reels and get paid to show them in a house for a week. That kind of thing would happen here. You know, you wanted to have a Christmas party, that happened in the building. Ham and bean suppers and church socials that couldn't be held in the church proper, weddings for workers, all that kind of stuff happened in Rodman Hall. And of course, every story has to have a disgruntled worker. So here we have a disgruntled worker who was fired by Rodman's son for drinking on the job. So he proceeded not to learn a lesson. He went out and got really drunk and came down and burned down the Rodman Hall. So that's the reason we don't have it. Also, we have a great opportunity here to look at the beginnings of, it's nice and quiet here, of the first place that Robert moved into. Robert Rodman, when he came here, he had this little house built. That was where Robert Rodman lived in the beginnings when he first moved in here with his family and had the small wooden mill to operate. And when he had the other buildings constructed, he eventually added what I like to call a Rodman barn to every Rodman house. You can see one on Ann and on Fanny's. Now, on Ann and on Fanny didn't have enough stuff to fill up that barn, and here this barn has been transformed into housing, and every other one of the Rodman row houses at their peak had a barn like this. It was perfect for the Rodman manufacturing because he could store equipment in there, you know, carriages and such, and things he didn't have room to store on the mill property could be stored in all these Rodman barns that he constructed on Rodman Row here. And it's nice to see a barn like that being retooled, reutilized for housing, keeps it in the 21st century. behind one of the Rodman houses that is now all condos. We see a big barn that they had there, also made into housing that's utilized now to this day. So it's all pretty cool to see this stuff being reutilized. The buildings, the church itself, eventually was a church for quite a while into the very end of the 1970s. So it ran as a church for about 100 years, but the congregation dwindled to a point where they will move back into the Hornbeam Chapel, and the building sat empty for a long time. And this is where I like to give a shout out to people who really were instrumental in making sure that Lafayette stayed Lafayette. And we have a baker here, and we've already talked about Mike Baker stepping up, seeing the potential in the mill, and also seeing the beauty in the mill buildings and utilizing them and saving them and restoring them and turning them into something that can be used in the 21st century. But you also have another family involved in this village that also stepped up, and that was Ken McKay, the dad of the McKay brothers who run McKay's Furniture now. He too loved this village, saw the potential in the buildings. They purchased one of the Rodman buildings and turned it into McKay's front porch, saving that building. And they also, when they lost a warehouse building that was on Lafayette Road, rather than building another metal warehouse building, Ken saw this building was empty and realized, although it's not an ideal use for it, it was ready to come down. And so the McKay family purchased the church, took the pews out, and now use it for furniture storage. They've maintained the building. Yes, it's not a church, but it's still here and is still a part of the community. So my hats go off to, I went to high school with the McKay brothers, so I don't give them too much cred. You know, I don't want to get their heads any bigger than they already are. But the reality is, without these two people, Mike Baker and Ken McKay, saying, you know, there's beauty in this village. Because if you've been around for a while, you saw Lafayette prior to the housing market getting so high, getting run down and looking a little shabby. And having these kinds of things happen in the village helped bridge the gap until people began looking at these old mill houses and saying, this is the only kind of house I can afford, but there's a lot of potential here. I can take this house, I can fix it up, and I can make it into something special. And Lafayette has revitalized itself in the last 30 years. Most of the old mill houses that were looking pretty sad are owned by people who love them and care for them and have brought them into the 21st century, so that's great. So let's walk down the way and we'll start talking about the Rodman mansions. Usually I've done it long enough, so every once in a while this is all condos will come out and say, what are you doing here? But most of the people who have lived here long term are used to me, so it's usually been okay.
They're not going to come out with a gun.
They may. What the heck? A little excitement, you know.
Yeah,
you know. We'll survive it, right? Okay, before I talk about this wonderful home here, let's talk about that sad, neglected old field over there. And if you were here long enough, you know that there was once a pretty impressive building there as well. It ended its days as the Lafayette Nursing Home. But in the beginning, it was Franklin Rodman's house, and it was one of the grandest, finest buildings that you could ever imagine out there. It was had a beautiful front porch. Franklin thought of himself as a horticulturalist, and he had specimen trees, gardens there. He had a small pond on the property. It was just a beautiful place. It was one of Robert Rodman's sons. As time went on, the house was purchased and made into a nursing home in I believe the 1950s. And it ran as a pretty nice nursing home for a while. For some reason, somebody allowed them to put the brick addition on the front of the building, which ruined the building. I used to call it the brick canker that they put on the front of the building. And it still operated as a nursing home, but eventually it was not able to hold up to the new rigorous standards required for nursing homes. The modifications were going to be too much for the building, and so it closed down. It sat there empty for a while. Now, the town made every effort to help make it work so somebody could buy the building and turn it into something else. We tried to show them what the potential for the building was. If you took the brick addition off on the front, what a beautiful place it could be. And a person bought it. I won't name names, but he didn't like the constraints that were on the property because of the lot size and the zoning. So he tried to play a game with the town of North Kingstown of saying, well, I'm not going to do anything unless I get what I want. And the town was pretty adamant about not giving in to this guy because they looked at it as a a precedence that would be bad on development in communities like this. And so there was a waiting game went on, and it went into a time frame we like to call contractor planned neglect. Because what he wanted to do eventually was to be able to tear the building down and put on what he wanted there. He didn't care about the historic building, and so many contractors do that. You know, you're going to develop a development, there's an old farmhouse in it, well, you just leave it go until some building inspector comes in and says, it's too far gone, go ahead, tear it down. And that's the way a lot of building developers will operate, and that's what happened with that building. Sadly enough, it did finally get to a certain point. He tore it down. The town had given in on some of the things, and he went back to them and said, okay, now I'm ready to do something here. You gave me all these gimmies. He said, oh no, the building goes, the gimmies go away too. Didn't you read the fine print? So he got really mad, and he hasn't done anything with it since. So it's a sad story about what can go wrong in redeveloping buildings like that. The only thing left is a beautiful old beech tree that was just one of the many specimen trees that were on the property. But on this side, we have a perfect example of what can go right if everybody works together and makes this work. This was another Rodman house. This was Walter Rodman's house. He was an artistic man. He married a woman who was a member of a local family as well, the Ryan family, if you think about Ryan's Market, if you've been in town long enough. And they lived in this fine house. He too planted specimen trees. You're going to have a giant tulip poplar on one side and a giant, I guess, spruce or something on the other side. And the typical Rodman barn in the back, which has been made into housing. And the whole thing was purchased by a developer who really cared about it, worked with the town, and found a use for this building that allowed it to stay on in the 21st century. And it's a marvelous building, and you have the beautiful grounds, and it's really a selling point for getting a condo in this building, and it becomes a jumping off point for people who are trying to get into the real estate market and want to live in a beautiful place like this. It really is a wonderful use of the building, and it's allowed it to stay on because there are just not that many wealthy mill owners left in the world who can afford to have a house like this. We're going to walk back out on the property and go down to the front porch. Let's talk a little bit more about these buildings in general and about Robert Rodman's home. Okay, so this is Robert Rodman's house. We're in his yard right now, in between himself and his son, and on the other side, at our last stop, his daughter's home. And it's a great example of the architecture of the time for somebody who really had some money. It was fancier even than before. The upstairs, which was a lot of it was servant quarters, all had dormers all the way around for the servants to look out. The front porch had 2 granite lions on it on either side, all the required chairs so Robert Rodman could sit out there with his cronies and smoke cigars and plan how they're going to run the world, all that kind of stuff. But it was a grand home, really a grand home. And this actually came out of it in the restoration by the McKay family, because this points to the reality that there was a well in the house, and there was also, and this started actually kind of a funny battle between rich mill owners. All of Rodman's house have that peaked roof there, and up in the attic of every one of these houses was constructed a huge copper-lined oak tank so that Robert Rodman's wife would not have to use the outhouse. And indeed, these were the first homes in the area that had indoor flush toilets, and they were run by gravity fed from that oak tank. That was, it's very green technology. All the rainwater that fell on the roof would be channeled into the oak tank. Of course, you have a drought, but lucky for Robert Rodman, he had workers, and they had ponds on each of the properties, and a worker with a pump who could make sure that he'd fill the tank up in the roof if it needed to be, so Mrs. Rodman still did not have to go out to the outhouse. And Rodman's workers did not have to go out to get water from the well, because the well was actually in the kitchen. And this was under the floorboards, and we talked a little bit about the technology of stonemasons when we were on the walk, and I think this is another grand example of this. This is a well capstone for a pretty large well. And again, you see, as we talked about, the center hole where the well was, all the way around are these very short holes drilled into the side, and it's part of the technology of how stonemasons worked in the middle 1800s. Again, they were masters at selecting a piece of stone and knowing what they could do with it, how they could shape it, whether it would be able to be shaped the way they wanted it, will it break apart in the wrong way. So they'd select the stone they wanted for a capstone, rough out the shape of it, and then bring it up to a place like this and put it just like this, and then drill these holes with a star bit drill, which is a hand-powered kind of thing with a two-man operation with one, usually a boy holding the bit with his two hands, and hopefully for the boy, a very skilled man with a 10-pound sledgehammer. And so he would have to take the bit, and the guy would hit it with a sledgehammer, and it would put it in. He would then twist it a quarter turn, and the guy would hit it again, twist a quarter turn, hit it again. And it'd take quite a while to drill all these little holes through this really hard granite. And once he had the holes in the places he wanted, and this was usually would be done in November, he'd bring out some really hard oak or hornbeam wood plugs. He'd fill all the holes with water. He'd hammer the wood plugs into the holes, and then he'd go away until spring. Over the winter, the water jammed into those holes with those wood plugs, which would not allow it to expand, would want to expand anyhow when it froze, and it would crack the rock in the perfect circle that he wanted it in. He could come back with his same 10-pound sledgehammer when it was April and just go, bam, and the centerpiece would just drop right out, perfect. So it's one of those lost arts that we just don't have anymore, but that's how guys in the time frame worked stone. So this is a great example of that. And I talked about Robert Rodman providing everything for his community, really cradle to grave. You could buy the cradle at the store, and when you died, and say, oh, your great aunt Matilda died in February and the ground's too frozen to dig a grave, he even had a winter crypt in the back of his house where great aunt Matilda could be stored until the thaw came, you know. And a good winter crypt this is when the middle school kids, now the high school kids like the story about the genes, the middle school kids, then you hear boys going, oh, I want to be a crypt keeper. I'm like, yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, good for you. They would have an iron door on it because, you know, the worst thing about what would happen when you get into April, and let me tell you, when it gets warm, emptying the crypt was a pretty critical operation. You had to get that done and get people in the ground because they were starting to get a little ripe. But you didn't want to open up the crypt and see that a possum or a coyote got in there and chewed off Great Aunt Matilda's frozen arm. So I hope nobody has a Great Aunt Matilda. I usually pick that name because I've never had somebody come up to me and say I was offended by the use of the name Matilda. So, but it was a consideration, and then that's what I'm saying. Robert Rodman provided everything for his workers to keep them here. On top of the crypt, now you can see a nice hill. And if you're here at the right time, you notice that the woods are full of beautiful flowering shrubs, azaleas, rhododendrons, because at the time frame from 1880 until 1950, that was called Liberty Hill, and it was a picnic area for Robert Rodman's employees. Picnic tables up there. There was a big, tall spruce flagpole that flew the American flag, and people could come, go right through Robert Rodman's yard and go up to Liberty Hill and have a picnic. So he was providing absolutely everything for his people in the community, as I said, serving their religious needs, what they needed to buy, giving them jobs, giving them housing. So when you got here and you got a job here, you wanted to stay here. It was hard work, it was dangerous work, but in the time frame, these were considered fantastic jobs to work in the mills of folks like Robert Rodman and the Hazards. Any questions on that before we go to our last stop? The extension was put on the house in the late 1980s when the McKays purchased it. Before that, when I was a kid, I went to D. Malay here. It was the Masonic Temple for many, many years. It was utilized by the Masons for a long time, but they couldn't afford it anymore and built the temple just up 10 Rod Road away that was easier to heat and easier to maintain. And the building sat derelict for quite a while. When Mr. McKay bought it, vandals had gotten in there and cut out every bit of wire and every copper pipe in the building and stole it all, pretty much gutted the place. And instead of him saying, I'll just buy it, and there weren't as much restrictive zoning at that time, he could have bought it and tore it down, but no, he saw the guts of the building and he wanted to save it. And so, again, the McKay family stepped up and did something for the community in saving this building. It suits their needs. The interior of some of the spaces have been restored the best you can, and although I can't afford this fancy outdoor furniture, just go in there and pretend you're going to buy some and just walk around and look at the place, because they did a fantastic job. No, good. Ken's not here. He didn't hear me say that. Go in there and buy stuff. No, just go in there and see the building, because it's extraordinary what was done to fix that building up, and it's wonderful in there. It's beautiful. Some of the front parlor rooms are just like they would be if the Rodmans were here. Fireplaces with imported Italian tile, the whole 9 yards. It's really something. But we're going to go to our last stop and talk about Robert Rodman's daughter's house, because it has a good funny story to end on. Another woman fixed up the other building into apartments as well. So it's been so nice to see some of these really big buildings made good again. Okay, this is Robert Rodman's oldest child was his daughter Hortense. Already she's probably already mad at him, right? I mean, who's gonna Hortense? What are you gonna give a woman a name Hortense? Oh, my little cute little Hortense. So already she was probably mad, but she was the oldest child. She had a pretty good upbringing, as you can imagine. And when Robert Rodman built his house and his older daughter's house first. And the house that he constructed for in the beginning was considerably smaller. I mean, take this L off here that looks like a little building, this back piece, the wonderful portiche, and this decorative tower, and you can see the guts of the house he built for Hortense and her husband. Again, marriage being marriage, Hortense was, even though her name was Hortense, she was still somebody that really folks wanted to marry into this family, and a prominent member of the Allen family married Hortense, and they moved into this house. But it was Hortense's house. Father gave it to her. So the two sons, Walter and Franklin, were younger, and when they finished college, then he built the houses for them. And as you see from the one that's remaining, he built his kids some pretty grand houses. There was an architectural firm in Westerly that he hired to build those houses, and the houses are going up, and I can just picture, and this comes from diaries of folks who lived in the time frame, this story that we're going to talk about, Hortense getting, already, let's face it, she's going to be mad because her name is Hortense, but getting angry because her younger brother's houses are a lot fancier than hers, and it's just not sitting well with her. So the diary entries go that she got up one day finally and stormed out the front door, stormed right down where we were, went into her father's house, and just read him the riot act about the fact that her house is much plainer than her brother's. It's not right, it's not fair, you better fix my house up, and stormed back down to the house. So after probably the storm settled, Robert called up the architect in Westerly and said, we're going to have to do some more work. You're going to have to put in an addition on my daughter's house because it's not fancy enough anymore. And the addition was added. At the same time, young Miss Ryan, who had married her brother, had as a hobby pottery, and she wanted to start her own pottery studio. And so when that house was built, a full-scale pottery kiln and pottery studio was put in the basement there. Hortense also said, I've told you a million times I want to learn how to play the organ, so I expect that to be included in the addition. So Robert, probably being fed up, bought a large full-scale church organ and put it in the addition. And it can't come out because it's too big. It was put in there when the addition was constructed. So Hortense could practice her organ while her sister-in-law was making pottery down there. And it just shows you the kind of a world that they lived in. There's still a connection to the pottery studio that I like to add to the end. I mean, we know that if you lived in town long enough, the front parking lot in Brown Street in Wickford is called Ryan's parking lot. And it was purchased by Robert Rodman, which is interesting. Why? And given to the Ryan family, so that his daughter-in-law could have a store in Wickford to sell her pottery in. So they bought the lot, they built a store on it, so Walter's wife could sell her pottery in the pottery studio. And she was a Ryan, and when she died, she left the lottery, or the pottery store and the land associated with it, to her brothers who are now running Ryan's Market, and they tore the building down after she passed away and made the parking lot. So that's how they ended up with the parking lot, which is kind of interesting. So that concludes our tour. I hope you've learned an awful lot about the village of Lafayette. If there's questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes?
How did the Ryans end up with this house then?
Through the connection being married into the Ryan family, in the day when I was a teenager, Jeff Ryan and his wife, they lived in that house over there for a while, and part of it, and one of the 5 brothers who ran Ryan's Market, Dave, Ryan had purchased this house, and it's the only one of these mill mansions that's still a single family home, and it's still owned by Ryans to this day, taking care of it. Julie Ryan now has the house after her brother EJ passed away, and they've taken the time to maintain it in its splendor, and it is a labor of love to keep a house that big going, a house built 175 years ago. You really got to love the building, and she does, and her brother and their father before them took care of the house, and we're blessed to have it here, still looking as beautiful as it is, and giving us an idea of the kind of life that the Rodman family lived.
That organ, by the way, is still in the music room is when you come in the front door to the left, and it goes into the basement. So it comes up through the basement.
It's that big of an organ. There's no getting it out.
When was it named Lafayette?
It was named Lafayette soon after the Revolutionary War, and it was named Lafayette at that time frame. It was just a little, a wide spot in the road at that time frame until Robert Rodman put his enterprise in here, which I think is kind of funny. We do have another good funny story. Now, in this house over here, a gentleman named Eric de Rochambeau lives. And he's mad all the time about living in a place called Lafayette, because his ancestors, the one who really helped out the Rhode Island colonists during the, Lafayette really didn't do anything except go through here. Why isn't this place called de Rochambeau? I said, I can't answer you that one, but he is correct. General de Rochambeau from France did a lot more for Rhode Island during the war than Lafayette ever dreamed of doing, but he did get the village named after him.
Same reason the Pell Bridge isn't called the Chaffee Bridge.
Yeah.
Tim, is this information in one of your books?
This one is spread out throughout all the columns, and then you can get all there's individual columns in each and every one of them. Doing a Lafayette book is maybe something I'll actually get to soon. Because it really does have a great story, and a remarkable story that ties in so many facets of modern life, all the way from your Levi jeans to indoor flush toilets. All of it you can learn it all in this place. It's got a great story, and it's also a story of entrepreneurship. That's really what this is all about, and the entrepreneurship continues today as people look at these buildings and find new ways to make them work in the 21st century, and that's the challenge. It is a challenge, and the nursing home building is an example of the failure of that. But in North Kingstown, we've been pretty lucky with people with vision coming out and using these buildings. In so many other communities, they all just get torn down. Think about Warwick and what it might have been, and even East Greenwich. They lost so many of their buildings until their community said enough. And it's great that we have so much here in North Kingstown.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Yep.
There was one of the bells
Mhm.
from the mill is now at St. Bernard's Church.
Yes, that's St. Bernard's Church. Yep.
So it's there.
Yeah.
You can see that was the bell that I think they would actually ring.
Oh yeah, they ring it, call people to work. Yeah.
Is that called the potato bell?
And they rang the potato bill at 5 o'clock, so the wife would know to start supper. Husband will be home at 7. So yeah, it was. It's got a great part of the history for sure. So.
It resides there.
Yep. Well, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your weekend. I appreciate your time, and we'll all haul ourselves back. We don't have a bus this time, so we won't have to walk.